Okay, well, welcome everybody to the roundtable, the Depot Roundtable on the political economy of deindustrialization. I'm Stephen High. I'm a professor of history at Concordia University, and it's my pleasure to chair this session. Questions of political economy have been central to the study of deindustrialization since the field's emergence in the 1970s and 1980s. Today's roundtable brings together presentations of the 5 draft book chapters that comprise the political economy section of the Routledge Handbook on Deindustrialization Studies, whose lead editor is Tim Strangleman. Now, I'm not sure if Tim is here, but he just retired, so he's allowed not to be here, right? He's still editing, but I think he's got other plans, right? Anyways, our focus today is on the how and why of deindustrialization. And I think increasingly the field is sort of returning to that, to that sort of core framework of like, what's this process and economically and politically and so on. Now, drawing for his part from the Black radical tradition in North America and the Caribbean, geographer Jason Hackworth, who joins us here from the University of Toronto, speaks to how anti-Blackness was baked into industrialism in the United States and around the world, and how it subsequently structured the process of deindustrialization. As Jason writes, subsequently, the landscapes of abandonment in Detroit and Cleveland are disproportionately located in Black majority neighborhoods. Capital flight and white flight are thus 2 sides of the same coin. Hackworth's piece invites us to consider how race and class intersect and reinforce each other. I'm going to go through all the different presentations and we'll come back. For their part, French historians Marion Fontaine and Xavier Vigna. Xavier is here today. Marion is, I think, teaching today, so she won't be joining us, but we have, la moitié de l'équipe française pour aujourd'hui. Now, Xavier and Marion pose the question, what are the factors driving working class resistance in certain contexts? And why are industrial closures mostly met with silent despair? Drawing from social movement theory, they consider the factors that contribute to a politics of resistance to industrial closure. Grounding their analysis in France, but having a wider transnational sort of horizon, they offer a periodization of political resistance since the 1950s. And I think this is a very important initiative. I don't think we've seen that kind of periodization in other national contexts. Resistance also underpins the contribution from sociologist Alice Ma, who joins us from now at the University of Glasgow, who explores how the just transition idea has its origins in the US labor movement during the 1980s, when it sought to reconcile the jobs versus environment conundrum. Best known for her centering of ruination as a key framework for understanding deindustrialization, Alice modifies this idea in her paper in proposing toxic industrial ruination as a framework. What can we learn from past transitions to ensure that the coming global transition away from fossil fuels is a just one? Thinking critically about anticipatory or future deindustrialization in relation to past experiences is something new for our field of research. Given the geographic unevenness of economic rise and decline, the promotion of regional economic diversification emerged as a key policy response to 20th century deindustrialization. In his contribution to this section, Canadian historian Lachlan MacKinnon considers the role of the state in countering regional industrial decline. His chapter is anchored in Atlantic Canada a peripheral region, sorry, I'm not sure if I can say that. Okay, like we'll call a peripheral region from the perspective of Toronto. Where was I? Okay, that was once largely dependent on the fisheries, forestry, and mining, with some pockets of heavy industry such as Sydney, Nova Scotia, where many of us in Depot were in last summer. Lachlan's contribution speaks to the ways that regional development ideas crisscross the Atlantic and across national borders. Today's session ends with an impassioned appeal from Fred Burrill and Matthew Penney. Now, Matthew is here right now. Fred might join us. He's at a job interview, so he chose that over us, right? But we're hoping that he joins us before the end with a big smile. If he comes in smiling, we can all like give him a round of applause. How's that? I'm not sure if I should have told everyone that, but anyway, so be it. They're historians of Canada and Japan, respectively. Their passionate appeal for the field to break out of our national silos and examine the overriding logic of capitalism itself. Industrial closures are not just the result of a few bad corporate apples or some failure of capitalism to function properly, but deindustrialization is literally capitalism at work. To understand deindustrialization as political and economic process, we must go beyond its effects and analyze the structural forces at work. With that in mind, they suggest that the field would do well to re-engage with Marxist theory and praxis. So we're going to start off with Jason. Each person has up to 10 minutes to present, and then we'll hold the questions to the end. So Jason, welcome.
Welcome. All right, thank you very much, Stephen. I'm happy to go first. Unlike Fred, I don't have a job interview today. No one has wanted to hire me for years, so I'm ready and willing to go. And also wanted to thank you, Stephen, and whoever else was involved in including me in this project, both the sort of broader project, but this particular assignment of the chapters, because it really, unlike a lot of the queries I get about writing chapters for this and that and the other, this one really met what I was thinking about at the time, and it was really quite a pleasure to kind of work through some of these things. As the title of the chapter is the racial dimensions of deindustrialization. D is in parentheses to sort of indicate a flexibility that there are different dimensions at different times. And it was an opportunity to kind of think about the intersections between these very disparate literatures. There's vast literatures, of course, on issues of racial discrimination at a variety of different scales in different societies, et cetera. There is conversely vast literatures on industrial capitalism, deindustrialization, and these don't always intersect. And I would submit maybe most of the time do not. But there are some really interesting instances where they do, and that's where I've tried to sort of synthesize in this chapter. So I thought I would just very, very briefly, I'm very mindful of the time, go through some of what I came up with and my sort of thinking about it. And again, just to kind of emphasize like two, so one theoretical bias and another geographical bias that I think is important, because I don't think it's really possible to fully encapsulate this kind of genre of literature. Is that my theoretical emphasis, yes, as Stephen had mentioned, is the Black radical tradition, the US and Caribbean, W.E.B. Du Bois in particular, and some of his insights, and the geographic bias. Most of my work is on North America, but I have Europe in mind. I still think that there's a vast, vast world outside of that where some of these issues have a different flavor. So I divided the chapter into kind of two broad categories: the dimensions of industrialization and then the dimensions of deindustrialization. And I'll sort of briefly go through the kind of subcategories under each of those. Under industrialization, there were 5 categories where various scholars have identified the role that the sort of construction of race, particularly racial capitalism scholars, racial capitalism being the kind of emphasis, really the merger of racial discrimination and political economy literatures, the notion that race is a construct that is used to kind of justify the exploitation of or dispossession of land or labor from non-white peoples at some point in time or in some, and so, you know, that sort of manifests in a variety of different ways. The first, I would think in most historical terms, is serving as a kind of justification for low cost inputs to the industrial economy, enslavement, colonial pillage, generating raw materials that were then pushed into the European and North American industrial machines, the garment industry in particular. And Du Bois talks a great deal about this, right? That this sort of, you know, while there wasn't sort of mass enslavement in places like Europe, it served these narratives of sort of superiority served as a kind of justification for this kind of brutality to this kind of global order, to sort of particularly the South, particularly citizens in countries that sort of built their identities around egalitarianism, but were reading about, you know, things that were clearly not egalitarian that were done in their name. So justifying low cost inputs. The second that some other industrialization scholars have pointed both in the distant past and maybe the more recent past, is naturalizing poorly paid or dangerous work, that not all industrial jobs are the same. Some are incredibly dangerous, toxic, whatever, and that this work tended initially to go, and Cedric Robinson, one of the sort of kind of godfathers of the racial capitalism literature, points to this kind of an early industrial Europe, that many of the sort of industrial workers, when industrial work was very, very dangerous, no matter what its nature, were thought of as kind of racial minorities, Irish, Roma, the figures that in Europe that were sort of, and this was seen as sort of beneath the citizenry of Britain, British citizens. So rationalizing that work, and then later in the early 20th century, Tom Segru and others writes about sort of how in the automobile manufacturing industry, that sort of the only work that Black workers in the United States could obtain often was in the painting and the sort of often the most toxic elements of the sort of process. So naturalizing that, sort of coming up with a justification for that was the third that has been discussed, you know, limiting unionized industrial work to white workers, both through collusion by the firms themselves, but also the unions themselves, which often prohibited non-white laborers, Indigenous people in Canada, Black people in the United States, Black people in Canada as well, from being part of the, you know, and this served to kind of have, you know, to kind of puncture the sort of notion of, you know, class only. The flip side of this, number 4, being pitting white and non-white workers against one another, kind of using that antipathy in different ways, particularly when white workers were becoming too militant, and to sort of bring in Black or other non-white laborers to break strikes, and the ways that sort of punctured you know, a kind of class solidarity. And the 5th being the kind of broader geopolitical maintenance of the color line through foreign policy, through kind of maintaining the kind of, even to this day, the kind of a kind of racial color line in at different times, it's sort of justifying pillage of the global South, and keeping industrial capitalism out of those locations for many years, to now a kind of flip side of you know, placing industrial work only under very, very exploitative circumstances in much of the global South. So those are the kind of dimensions that I sort of felt like under the industrialization of the rise of industry. The second section is under the deindustrialization, and a lot of this follows my recent book, as Stephen alluded to, Manufacturing Decline. And these are sort of the ways that which deindustrialization has been sort of more disproportionately felt by non-white workers in certain locations. Again, there's you know, a great deal of variation, but sort of the emphases in the areas I've been looking at. One is this sort of the disproportionate focus of very destructive fixes, and I use quotation mark fixes, to urban decline, such as urban renewal, such as, you know, these efforts to kind of make the city accommodate the new forms of industrialization, have disproportionately meant removal or displacement to non-white people in those locations, often who were excluded from the industrial economy to begin with. Second, the continued flight of white people from Black spaces, and this is what sort of, you know, my work in Detroit, Cleveland, at these kinds of places, that it's not just that sort of industrial work was sort of taken away, that there's sort of the same ambient prejudice, refusal of white people to live in or have their children schooled with Black children, has had enormous impacts on those particular places, collapse demand in the very places that Black people reside. And so there is no sort of coincidence in my mind that there's such a kind of a visual correlation, at least in those locations. Third, continued employment discrimination and polarization in a post-industrial environment. We know that there's a kind of polarization that low-end service work and high-end kind of producer service work, that there are various kinds of residual reasons why, that there were differential access to those high-end jobs, but even at the lower end, and I think people like, have done audit studies about sort of how hard it is to get service work even, there's still continued evidence of employment discrimination, which has a sort of, in the post-industrial economy, a great deal of impact. And finally, the racial politics of victim blaming, something I call organized deprivation, or that is using the imagery of deindustrialization in places like Flint and Detroit and Cleveland, and in Europe, and places like Liverpool and very kind of visibly deindustrialized places, as a kind of form of victim blaming, of sort of taking, if it's assigned to one group, that this place was fine before this group got there. And so using it to justify, certainly in the United States, a kind of like, not just a sort of removal of responsibility, but an actual punishing of those places of kind of revenge or revenchism, as some have said. So just in conclusion, I would just say, in a lot of details I've left out, and I hope people have, have a chance to read, there's a lot more details in there. Conclude with 2 points. One is that there's no universal pattern here. This isn't sort of, these are industrialization and the intersection between industrialization and racism vary considerably by time period, region, and purpose. And I certainly don't mean to suggest that there's some sort of meta theory here. I also, and related to that, maybe the second and final point, is to suggest that, as I mentioned before, much of the literature on racial discrimination has nothing to do with industrial capitalism per se. Much of the literature on industrial capitalism doesn't really explicitly address issues of race, but I would submit in closing that in those rich instances where they intersect, there are important processes and patterns revealed that shed important light on both spheres. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jason. That's great. You got me thinking about Kant and underclass and cultures of poverty. And I think your framework here is really useful, and thinking about victim blaming and the punishing of places. I think that's a very powerful articulation. Let's move on to Xavier and sort of the politics of deindustrialization, challenging and politicizing, industrial closure. Xavier.
Thanks, Stephen. Good morning, and thanks a lot for the invitation in this panel. As you said, my presentation is based on a paper written with Marion, Fontaine, and we would like to start with two main remarks concerning deindustrialized France. First, there was no huge strike at the British miners' strike of 84-85, but as elsewhere, the visibility of the workers' movement was a key component. But a significant portion of closures took place quietly in the shadows. This visibility, or the invisibility, is linked with the repertoire of collective action, which varied significantly between industries. The repertoire in heavy industries like steel industry or coal mines is different from the repertoire in textile or electric industries, with a more important feminine workforce. Second remark on the political parameter, we must pay attention to the moral economy evoked by the Deindustrializing Studies, and also to the social and political identities of the workers involved in planned closures. Most of the time, workers protested as workers, of course, but they protested as French citizens too, as inhabitants of a region or of their hometown, as husbands or wives, etc. And these plural identities were mixed or intertwined, but very often these workers called on the state to take action and protect them. So, as you said, Stephen, to present the French situation, we will insist on three periods. The first one from the late 50s to the early 70s. At the beginning, in the late 50s, workers faced pit closure within a process of modernization organized by the French state in a European framework. and they felt marginalized within certain territories, the countryside and traditional industries, where inhabitants seemed abandoned by public authorities and technocratic elites. For them, the main concern was the future of these territories and the job market. They insisted on investing and establishing new factories for their children, but the word deindustrialization itself was absent. People talked about modernization and started worrying about unemployment in coal field and all industrial regions, including rural areas. Then a huge wave of strikes occurred in May-June 1968, which inaugurated a resurgence of factory shop struggle, often with violence like boss napping. But these offensive protests seemed incapable of stemming the rising tide of industrial crisis, which started to hit several branches. Second period, from mid-70s to mid-80s, when difficulties were gradual, unemployment grew sharply with a widening number of industrial branches confronted with economic problems and closure. Spectacular bankruptcies happened in shoes, steel, shipbuilding, mechanic, etc. And senior civil servants started to use the term deindustrialization in the second half of the 70s. The workers' responses were usually on-site struggle with occupations that lasted several months, sometimes several years. Trade unions organized marches and rallies to protect closure and defend French industries against foreign concurrence, especially against American and German companies. But the most significant innovation was the spread of union radio stations publicizing struggle in Lorraine and North region in particular. Facing unemployment, workers claimed for nationalization, and most of them hoped the election of a left-wing president. After Mitterrand election in 81, the disappointment was severe because despite the support policy and some nationalization, for instance, the steel companies, redundancies continued in industrial branches in crisis. And therefore, a kind of rupture between the political left and workers happened during this period because the workers felt betrayed by the socialist government. Last period, from the mid-80s to the beginning of 21st century. The French state transformed with privatization of public companies and abandoned all industrial policies, which meant truly an acceptance of industrial decline in a new international of labor. Concerning trade unions, they were unable to act at a European scale, gathering workers from different plants and different countries, and were unable to consider this new international division in their collective mobilizations. Facing this situation, the workers' responses changed slowly. Long struggle occupying plants tended to disappear, whereas short and violent protests occurred with ransacking and destroying offices, sometimes with environmental blackmail. These spectacular protests were indeed in the minority. These were bursts of a fragmented and diminished group, and in most cases, these protests were weak and therefore important mobilizations. Sometimes led-off workers, especially women, wrote about their past, their plant or their shop, as Jackie Clark has shown with the Moulinex factory in Normandy. But the industrialization remained largely an unspoken or untold process. Therefore, and that's my conclusion, Marion and I think that the industrialization is a process which has left very few traces in collective memories France, even though it has been and remain very painful. This absence of memory traces is a daunting problem because it prevents from naming what happened. This absence also is haunting the left and the labor movement as a major event, both omnipresent and elusive, to which the country should relate and which the country should repair. Workers demanded jobs, justice, state intervention, and continue to do so. They demanded and still demand that the state, with an industrial policy, protect them and take into account the whole country, not just the main cities. In France, as is Belgium or in Italy, for different reasons, this gap continued to be the bedrock of the far right. Thank you.
Yeah, such important research you folks are doing, and it makes me think a lot about, again, like you opened with like visibility and invisibility, and how, you know, how the collective actions of workers were central to making it visible, right? And I also really appreciated like how you sort of rethink the whole periodization, right? We tend to often focus just, same as Jason was in terms of urban renewal, right? Expanding, you know, our thinking in terms of the duration of this process, right? This most recent wave of this process. And I think this is really useful for those of us working in other national contexts too. Now we're going to move from like the past to the future, but by way of the past, we're going to move to Alice. Alice Ma, please. I'm not sure if you're speaking, Alice, but we don't hear you.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, just let me get the screen up. Okay, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yeah, it's
okay.
Great.
Okay, thanks very much. So yeah, I think it's fitting that today is supposed to be the last day of the COP28 negotiations, and we're still in very contested terrain when it comes to thinking about just transitions for whom, and what that would mean in the context of kind of the hypocrisy of rich nations. So the talk I'm going to give today is about the urgent need to think about the future of just transitions and how that links to deindustrialization studies. As probably many of you know, the concept of just transitions, while it's a very mainstream climate policy term, and in fact, everybody who thinks about it generally thinks about it in terms of climate policy, is actually a concept that comes from the trade union movement. And I think that's important to remember that heritage coming from the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union in the United States in the 1980s, in which union leaders argued that there's a need to plan transitions away from polluting industries that are bad for workers' health, and to offer those workers social protections and their communities as well, and to retrain them and offer them new livelihoods as well. Now, this history has in some ways been forgotten in the context of the rebirth, in a way, of the term as a mainstream policy for climate at the highest levels, the UN, EU, Canadian government. It remains highly contested, and especially in the context of the fact that many of these transitions that have happened in the past, transitions away from coal, from heavily polluting industries, have been deeply unjust, leaving toxic contamination, not giving those transitions to better livelihoods, and leaving communities feeling very abandoned, and all those legacies of industrial decline. The key argument that I want to put forward is that in the context of ecological crisis, that we do need to do more work as scholars, as activists, as citizens, to anticipate and plan for future just transitions that are future ones as well as ones that are ongoing, that do involve deindustrialization. Because if we don't do so, then we risk repeating the past and repeating the present. That is, these will be deeply unjust and will burden the most poor and vulnerable communities around the world and in different countries and regions. So in order to think about this, I think it's instructive that although in deindustrialization studies in general, in this group as well, there's more of a focus perhaps on history and on present day, but not so much on the future. But one of the also kind of contentious figures from the 1970s, Daniel Bell, talked about this idea of the coming of post-industrial society as a venture in social forecasting, in which Bell predicted that there would be this post-industrial transition away from manufacturing jobs towards an information and knowledge economy. In some ways, some of what he predicted came to pass, but of course, in many ways it didn't. He didn't anticipate the devastation of many communities that have experienced deindustrialization, nor did he account for the fact that many of those jobs and industries would shift globally to the more poor or vulnerable areas of the globe. But nonetheless, he did predict that there would be future deindustrialization, and that did happen. I think it's interesting to counterpose this with a similar forecasting experiment in the 1970s around the same time, the Limits to Growth, which argued that if basically humanity kept on the same course of industrial production, then we would reach and exceed the carrying capacity of the Earth, and therefore face ecological collapse. And therefore, basically, they argued for the need for future deindustrialization in order to respond to that emergency. And so in a way, both predicted future deindustrialization, but had different sort of normative stances towards it. I think there's been a bit of a loss of that kind of thinking within a lot of scholarship, especially in sociology, which is my discipline, and in many of the social sciences. A lot of that kind of forecasting is happening more in, for example, the international governmental climate change predictions or other kinds of modeling. But this is something that is actually really important as critical scholars to engage with, thinking about what are the implications of our actions, our research, our scholarship for the future. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we can learn from deindustrialization studies and how that kind of idea that there's a dichotomy or a conflict between jobs and environment is actually not as true or as reified as we might think. One is through the idea of what Rebecca Elliott calls the sociology of loss. I think this is really interesting because when I read her article about climate change and the sociology of loss, it really resonated with some of the thinking I've done on deindustrialization studies, where she talks about how actually the sociology of loss examines what does, will, or must disappear rather than what can or should be sustained. And that this is really important for thinking about not just about how we study climate change, but also how people cope with and understand and accept and deal with climate change as loss. And I think if you think about deindustrialization studies, and Tim Strangleman's work is really important here as well, as many in the room here, is that a lot of the deindustrialization stories are about coping with loss, all its complexities. Strangleman does worry that sometimes these loss stories actually iron out complexity and contradiction, which is kind of an interesting juxtaposition with Elliott's work, where actually she thinks that idea of loss adds the complexity. But I think coping with loss in either way, we're losing the climate, we're losing our life systems, we're losing our economies and our communities. These are intertwined, and I think they could work together to think about what we want to sustain in the future. And I think sometimes the register isn't necessarily through social science or history, is through art. I was really moved in the town I've just moved from, Coventry, where as part of the COP26 deliberations, there's an exhibition called Listening to the Anthropocene at the Coventry Cathedral and at the Coventry Transport Museum, different events. And this wonderful work by the artist Mike Stubbs called Climate Emergency Services. So he does bespoke kind of tailored vehicles where he took this, and he loves the car, and he loves the motor car, which is the emblematic production of Coventry. It's known as the Motor City. So this is a van that's been modified like souped up motor cars with the flames of the emergency, and it's got mounted onto it like a military like sniper gun, but what he projects out of it is bird song. And it's sort of like this idea of this emergency vehicle that goes around addressing the climate emergency, but it's of course carrying the baggage of its past. So it's this idea of a conflicted vehicle, which I think is a really emotive and beautiful way of capturing that contradiction. But I think where I'm sitting with this is about thinking about the legacies of our past, the toxicity of industrial ruination. Of course, we can think about what's sad, about what's lost, about the jobs, about the community, about the fellowship. But one of the things that many people would agree on is that the toxicity that's left behind, that remains and endures in the landscape, is one of the most sort of pernicious and unpleasant aspects of our shared heritage. And it just, over the past year, researchers have said we've now crossed the planetary boundary of chemical and plastics pollution alongside the climate crisis and many other planetary boundaries. So we now are living within unsafe limits of chemical pollution throughout the world. And I think there's different sides of thinking about ruination in the future and transition. One of the more negative is proposed by Cassia Paprocki on their work on Bangladesh, where they talk about anticipatory ruination, where in anticipation of climate adaptation, some governments or economies are actually investing in very destructive kinds of ecological practices. In this case, they talk about how shrimp aquaculture is promoted instead of rice agriculture, with the idea that it would be more ecologically friendly, but it's actually absolutely devastating. So you really have to be careful about thinking about how we plan for these transitions. But I think there are some really important lessons to be learned from the mistakes of the past, and also from the things that were beautiful and we want to keep from the past, from deindustrialization studies. So I think it's important to think really long and hard about what the obstacles are, but also what the stakes are in just transitions. And I think also it's not just about what is lost, to flip Rebecca Elliott's idea, but it's also about thinking about what can and should be sustained. It's recognizing what Elizabeth Crider-Reed and Sarah May call toxic heritage, that contradictory heritage that we all have of toxicity and toxic material landscapes embedded in our worlds. Thinking about those unjust transitions and what they've left behind, not just erasing that memory, thinking through the difficult dilemmas of jobs versus environment conflicts, the deep structural inequalities between different and across different scales of where people live and do their work and exist, and the different kinds of values that are not always easy to match up or to reconcile. So I think these transitions that we need to think about in the future and now need to be proactive versus reactive, not just after the jobs are lost, and asking those hard questions of just for whom. So whose idea of justice and who will benefit and who will lose across supply chains. So about where those green technologies are made, who's going to get those green jobs, who's going to lose out from those transitions, and thinking about longer timescales as well, about future generations and about multiple species. So, thank you.
And thanks so much, Alice, that was great. And I do think that, our field has something to offer these wider conversations, right? That our examination of, the failure to achieve a just transition, so frequently, right? I think there's a lot of learning there, right? That we can move, forward in time. Or perhaps if I turn, if you think of like Stefan Berger and his Rhenish capitalism, there's like how we did it right, but like how do you, like thinking about change, and transition as a process, a political process, and one that is, that involves power, right? And I think this is crucial. So this is really important work too. Next we have Lachlan MacKinnon on regions.
Well, I'm starting to wish that I'd gone first. Everybody's such a hard act to follow. These papers are all great. Give me a second while I share my screen. Can you all see this?
Yep.
All right. So recent work within, deindustrialization studies, however you want to call it, we've increasingly seen kind of focuses on transnational work, but we've also seen some attention to trans-regional work. And I'm thinking here of like Christian Wick's recent work on industrial heritage, where he writes, quote, regions like nations not only are administrative or economic units, they're also imagined communities that are reliant on historical narratives and visions for the future that legitimize their continuous existence as spatial entities. And we've seen other contributions in this area too. Stefan Berger and Paul Pickering's piece where they write about regions of heavy industry, also using that idea of imagined communities that contribute to the historical memory of industry and deindustrialization in a variety of ways, talking, of course, about the Ruhr, where a convergence of factors have resulted in kind of state-supported historical narratives of deindustrialization that are what they say, quote, densely reclaimed, curated, and narrated, an approach that places the region's industrial past within the domain of official kind of national historical narratives. Now, if we kind of contrast the Ruhr with other areas or other regions, of course, other places haven't benefited from the same kind of state-led heritage efforts, and in some ways are more able to include conflicting radical or activist-driven historical narratives. We see this in the UK, where people like Hilary Orange have written about industrial memories and how they correspond with bottom-up approaches to British kind of state-sanctioned industrial closures during the 80s, or in kind of Asturian Spain, where people like Ruben Vega describe kind of the cultural regional sensibilities surrounding deindustrialization. And although the specific kind of details differ in these regions, there is a consistent sense across the kind of recent work that we've seen that historical experiences related to industrialization and deindustrialization are kind of both embedded within conceptions of regional identity. And this is kind of what I'm focusing on in my chapter in this collection. So really, the argument that I'm putting forward in the chapter is that I think we need to be more explicit about how these processes happen and how we employ the idea of region as an analytical lens to examine the historical experience of deindustrialization, thinking about it as a mechanism that affects how states act, how social movements emerge, and so on. So while much of our focus in the discipline has been on the ways in which these ideas of region have influenced kind of how working class experiences and cultures are memorialized or commemorated, especially in industrial heritage, I think it's also essential to recognize that in many instances, regional identities evolved alongside the processes of industrialization and class formation, much earlier than the kind of period that we often look at. And so these identities, I think, play a role in shaping, as I said, how various states choose to respond or not respond to, whether you call it uneven development or deindustrialization or industrial closure. I think that this kind of axis of region kind of has some meaning for this. So in this respect, I think there's a valuable opportunity for more research at the intersection of what I look at, regional economic development policy and deindustrialization. So looking at a case study of the Atlantic region of Canada, I hope to explore the rise of kind of regional identity, which is rooted, I think, nationally in the way that the Canadian economy kind of develops in an uneven way, but also think about how these identities and sentiments then inform the political responses to deindustrialization later in the really in the post-war period and into the 1960s, as we see regional development kind of emerge as a collective response in different provinces in Canada, and indeed, of course, in Europe as well, in different places. Now, in Atlantic Canada, the area that I'm looking at, these roots can kind of be traced to major economic shifts that we saw during the late 19th century after Confederation. Waves of European kind of settler colonialism coupled with the industrialization and centralization of the national economy created a host of pressures that led to a reorientation of the kind of regional Atlantic economy, shifting it away from its traditional moorings in north-south kind of coastal trade and pushing it towards continental integration with points west. Now, these circumstances and these changes did set the stage for the industrialization of the area, prompting a boom in manufacturing, the early growth of coal and steel, and so on. But we also see it coinciding with what some have called the first major wave of deindustrialization in this region, the collapse of the wooden shipbuilding industry. So Eric Sager and Gerald Panting write, quote, ship owning and shipbuilding in this region did not simply decline. These industries collapsed in the late 19th century, with local fleets shrinking to a third of their 1880 size by 1900. And so the decline of firms within that sector and the collapse of those small communities was kind of made invisible by the availability of a growing industrial and manufacturing kind of sectoral workforce. But nonetheless, I think that experience then kind of carries on forward in history. So between 1880 and 1910, so during this time, we see this, this region experience, like I said, this industrial growth alongside the sort of collapse of earlier industries. We saw the coal fields of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick attract workers from further afield. But again, this boom of industry was also short-lived. By the 1920s, we see another major wave of kind of regional deindustrialization, where we saw kind of plant closures across the manufacturing hubs of the area. We saw crisis in the coal industry in Nova Scotia, as well as kind of plant closures, protracted unemployment, and the beginning of what Gary Burrill describes as like a long-lasting out-migration crisis. And you can go through each province and kind of see how this is, influential, right? You can look at New Brunswick and see how the recession following the First World War during the interwar period bankrupted many of the lumber barons, provoking a sharp crisis. David Frank writes about the manufacturing hub of Amherst in Nova Scotia, talking about how industrial employment in manufacturing was virtually wiped out. In PEI, although it hadn't industrialized to the same degree as the other provinces, you see how efforts to diversify were short-lived and also suffered from periodic crisis. And so Newfoundland as well, although it didn't join Canada until later, 1949, we see the same sort of economic crises taking shape in the 1920s and 1930s, indeed informing the later decision to join Canada. And so indeed, we see Margaret Conrad and James Hiller write of 242 businesses declaring bankruptcy in Newfoundland in just the 2 years between 1921 and 23, creating kind of a public debt crisis and so on. And so thinking about this kind of earlier period of multi-sectoral deindustrialization across the Atlantic region, I also wanted to see how kind of workers and the bottom-up responses to these pressures that emerged. And of course, this has been talked about a lot in various literatures about the region and about industry in Canada. We saw, Ernie Forbes working on the maritime rights movement, which emerged during the 1920s and really kind of conformed with this sense of like regional identity, right? This idea that this part of Canada, for a variety of reasons, was not being economically developed in a way that matched other parts of the country. But I think you also see regional sentiment converge with kind of working class politics and other sorts of modes of resistance that come about during the 1920s as well, such as the Amherst General Strike in 1919, again, conforming with this period of kind of crisis, Cape Breton labor wars in the 20s, the Fishermen's Protective Union in Newfoundland, trade unionism across New Brunswick, signaling sort of a broad working class response to this kind of earlier wave of industrial closure and kind of crisis. So what I'm trying to get at in the chapter is how the generational memory of these struggles and this earlier wave of kind of regional deindustrialization inform the kind of political actions that are taken in the decades after this. So 1937, we see Nova Scotia pass the first Trade Union Act in Canada, partially to avoid kind of some of the types of open conflict that characterized the industrial crisis of the 20s. And meanwhile, the government of Canada as well began enacting legislation that would form the basis for sort of labor legalism and things like the Roel-Sirois Commission that kind of spoke about the Canadian economy in regional terms. Sorry. I think it's no coincidence that this is also the same time then that different layers of government in Canada began adopting that framework of regional development as kind of a response to ideas of disparity, of course, opposed to kind of Marxist ideas of capital accumulation as being responsible for all of this. So ultimately, I think if we reconsider the social movements, class politics, and open conflicts of the interwar period in this particular part of the country, as a response to kind of an earlier wave of deindustrialization, I think that this moment really produces like a material rationality for the later emergence of regional economic development and state action in response to the industrial crisis of the 1960s. So ultimately, the deindustrialization of certain sectors of the Atlantic economy that I kind of briefly went over here, coupled with the early failure of Canadian governments to kind of address those crises, led to protracted social conflict, the rise of movement politics, and class struggle. And regionalism then kind of directly informs these social movements and is increasingly kind of adopted by the federal government of Canada, as well as provincial governments, as an explanation that prompt kind of state action in later years. So we see like the expansion of state control, during the Second World War over the Canadian economy also provides kind of a evidentiary moment for the post-war kind of response. So as Canadian capitalism transitions in the aftermath of the Second World War, different levels of government are responding to this idea of regional disparity in different ways, usually through kind of direct state-led initiatives, which is what I call, the regional development model, which I get into further in the chapter. And it informs many, many projects at this time, right? We see the New Industries Program in Newfoundland, New Brunswick Development Initiatives, frozen food and PEI, the nationalization of coal and steel in Nova Scotia, in Cape Breton. And so thinking about how, these concurrent rise of regional development alongside kind of the emergence of another wave of deindustrialization, I think is really rooted to these earlier kind of sectoral changes that are based on the kind of specifics of the Canadian national economy and how it developed regionally. So digging into the kind of these historical roots, I think it reveals how this idea of region really shapes protest and social movements, as well as kind of political action by the time we get to the mid-20th century. And so as a result, I think that considering regional identity and how it corresponds with like earlier economic changes, industrialization, and social movements is an important step of thinking about why certain states take certain types of actions, later when we hit the 20th century industrial crisis of the late 60s into the 1970s and 80s. And so I think that this might provide some fruitful ground for future work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lachlan. Lots of points of connection there, I think, with Xavier's presentation. We're talking about how they're workers are mobilizing as workers, as national citizens, as attachments to region or locality. It makes me think, we talk a lot about like left nationalism. Can we also think about like left regionalism as maybe something that is an animating force? And I guess I'm thinking about your waves of deindustrialization, how they then, influence politically the next wave, right? And I think that's very, very useful. My critique of region is more around gender, that it tends to be very gendered, right? That it's really around like perceived centrality, like what are the sectors that are important, that are tied to usually the nation, right? And what's peripheral, in terms of where people work. I think your point around like region is bound up in these processes is really, really key. Our final presentation is from Matthew Penney and Fred Burrill. Is Fred back, or is I'm not sure if he is. We'll see if he's smiling or not.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, yeah, he's smiling, so that's good. So anyways, round of applause for Fred. Last but not least, Fred and Matthew on sort of bringing Marxian political economy back into the field's work.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Sorry for being late, everybody. It's nice to see your faces. It's been a little while. You all have heard me kind of say similar things, so I'm not going to take up too much of your time. I've teamed up with Matthew because he has smarter and more interesting things to say. So I'm just going to quickly summarize our paper, and then I'll turn it over to Matthew. So, the question of which Marx and why, I think is bagged by the sort of theoretical proclivities of the field. There are some Marxists that we mobilize heavily, Raymond Williams, E.P. Thompson, others that feature much less, Hobsbawm, Wallerstein, etc., that in fact would help us move towards a transnational framework. And I think one of the the historiographical reasons for why we have leaned towards some and not others have to do with the kind of the left nationalist roots of the field, at least in the Anglosphere, that that Stephen has written about in sort of Canadian left social democracy. In the US, we can think about Bennett and Harrison in the Union for Radical Political Economics, which was sort of a heterodox field, but essentially everybody who had a critique of American capitalism as it was welcome, and in practice that ended up being sort of a sort of left social democracy as well. So the framework of the nation and the nation state has been sort of hardwired into the field from the beginning, and that explains partially why why it's such a struggle and why we're only now making moves towards a kind of a transnational framework. So in our paper, we move from this discussion of historiography to thinking about three interrelated concepts that could help us understand deindustrialization transnationally. So one, obviously, that we talk about a lot in the field is uneven development, but not just that some places develop to the expense of others, but rather built into capitalist accumulation. There is a push towards the creation of absolute space, sort of a homogenized space, and that results actually inherently in the creation of relative space, so differentiation, and that these kind of contradictory push and pull drives are built into the framework. Secondly, we turn to Wallerstein and we think about world systems, not so much again that in the world there is a core and periphery, but that the core and periphery are defined by production processes. So so core production processes move towards monopolization, and periphery production processes are hyper-competitive. So this, this kind of intermeshing of these forms of production processes map on to the current state of the world economy, in which we have kind of the financialized center and the production process in the global south, and that these hyper-competitive processes in the global south are used to remake the relations of production in those places. We look specifically at China, but that they are built onto as well indigenous forms of relations of production, such that the transformation is so complete that we can't actually conceive of the return of those jobs, because those jobs as they existed in North America and in Western Europe no longer exist. The production process has been altered irreversibly. And then finally, we think about lumpenization, which is something Stephen and I have worked on as well. But thinking particularly about how the lumpenization, or the creation of relative surplus populations in the global north, is linked to what Samir Amin calls lumpen development in the global south, in which there are these hyper-competitive labor processes in countries like India and China and Bangladesh that generate almost 3/4 of the laboring population in those countries as kind of relative surplus themselves. So the creation of relative surplus populations in the global north is necessary for the transfer of capital from the north to the south. But in the south itself, there is a massive generation of relative surplus populations. Following the political economists Nielsen and Stubbs, we are entering a phase in capitalism in which the vast majority of the laboring population in the world is in fact relatively surplus to the needs of capital accumulation. And thinking about what does this mean for understanding deindustrialization, we are arguing that you can't understand deindustrialization without taking on capitalism itself as a form of production and accumulation. And with that, I'll pass it over to Matthew.
Thanks very much, Fred. Fred seems to think that I'm coming up with the good ideas, and I think Fred is, so it's a great collaboration in that sense. So good morning. I'm a historian of post-war Japan, and my major focus in my main research is historical representation and questions around the politics of our time, part of Depot, like right-wing populism and neo-nationalism. And it's through collaboration with Fred that I became interested in deindustrialization and transnational perspective. And I want to quickly share some of my reflections, which derive from many conversations, but also looking at deindustrialization from the point of view of East Asia, world systems theory, and Marxian critique of political economy. So together, I think these introduce some potentially fruitful directions of research that Fred and I point to in the Routledge piece. So first, I wanted to ask, what does settler colonialism look like in world systemic terms? And recent scholarship and indigenous activist perspectives have done a great job highlighting land theft, continuing forms of expropriation and violence, and other vital themes. But I want to ask, what does it mean, however, to look at Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, the Anglo settler colonies, from the point of view of East Asia? So the process of expropriation that created settler states gave them both world historical advantages for industrial production and also massive agricultural surpluses. So Canada at present is around 180% food self-sufficiency, and the surplus here becomes high-value exports, more so because we import cheap materials from the rest of the world and then export grain, beef, and other products for high prices. And in comparison, Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan, countries that made the transition from agricultural self-sufficiency to what were initially low-wage industrial exporters in line with the demands of both local elites and also global capital flows, now they overwhelmingly depend on food imports. Japan, for example, is under 40% self-sufficient, and its neighbors are little better. So in good times, they rely on industrial exports to buy the food they need for subsistence. And in bad, they're a few weeks away from mass hunger if there's a serious disruption of global trade. So this is not something that really appears from the point of view of Canadian political economy considered domestically, but it is certainly a part of Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, other countries in a world systemic sense, via industrial production in East Asia, which we often point to as the offshoring site, or the site where our jobs went. So this structural transformation is a part of a shift in global production that ties to deindustrialization in North America, but also to massive profits for agribusiness. So when thinking what reindustrialization might look like across the Anglosphere, we should try to see in world systemic connection the way transnational relations of production have been fundamentally transformed. It isn't that there's no going back to reinvigorated working class communities in these countries, but rather than thinking this, we have to think this politically in a way that reckons with fundamentally changed and interconnected worlds. A second point that I wanted to bring attention to involves social reproduction theory, which is an important part of the Marxian critical lineage that has three main facets. So it includes the day-to-day reproduction of labor power, the biological reproduction of the population as a whole, and then the reproduction of the capitalist system, including things like education, the propagation of ideology, and so on. Deindustrialization scholarship has often highlighted wage disparities, which give offshoring sites a competitive advantage. But when we look at historical and world systemic processes, like Japan's post-World War II industrial rebuilding and China's rapid growth from the 1980s, one thing that stands out is the huge number of migrants moving from rural to urban areas were often housed in dormitories in proximity to factories, with the subsistence part of social reproduction handled by workers, by paid cooks, cleaners, or indeed the workers themselves, overseen by managers who were essentially reproduction specialists. So reproduction was brought into the industrial process in these places. In post-deindustrialization Japan, and while this isn't always part of the conversation, Japan as well saw a significant hollowing out of industry from the 1990s, arguably from the early 1980s with the rollout of industrial robot technology and similar things. But in Japan, there's been a recent return to dormitories with low-wage temporary workers housed there, giving us a look at what we might call the wrong type of reindustrialization via the instrumentalization of social reproduction. And I should note as well that this is often the experience of migrant workers in North America, housed in dormitories, often in very poor conditions, as a part of agribusiness as well as new industrial formations. And in the case of China as well, collectivized living associated with Mao's thought. In the capitalist context in the 1980s, this became a fascinating and fraught ideological convergence. So workers were effectively prepared for the conditions of collectivized living in dormitories and similar sites by the earlier processes of China's post-World War II communist development. So while low wages are certainly significant, different contexts of social reproduction, which in the case of Japan and China, involve deliberate schemes by government working with industry to limit local consumption, while both went through their phase as factory of the world, bringing in capital based on their export industries. This is also key to consider. So the forms that social life takes and who has access to commodities, both at and far from the sites of production, is a deeply interrelated historical process that we can't simply reduce to the paycheck or the job. So I see these as two lines of analysis that came into focus when using the frameworks that Fred and I introduced in our piece, and I feel like they have the potential to be a strong addition to the already rich scholarly toolkit of deindustrialization studies. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great. Your description of like dormitories reminds me of my region of Northern Ontario, or and the shift away from sort of model towns, company towns, towards back to mining camps, right, where fly in, fly out, pure extractivism in a way. That said, you know, the whole idea of home ownership in a mining town is ridiculous, right? That people are anchored into a that has a finite lifespan, and have been devastated as a result. Okay, let's move over to questions. If you are interested in asking a question, I think we had 5 excellent papers. And so we'll just raise your electronic hand if you'd like to ask a question, of an individual or, across the panel. That would be great. And I'm not surprised at all that Stefan Berger is the first one to do it, but thank you, because you need to break the glass, right? So silence. So thanks, Stefan.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, I was waiting for a couple of seconds, but
you did.
Anyway, thank you very much to all paper givers. It was really fascinating to listen, and lots of insights, lots of interesting perspectives. I mean, I was thinking, this is obviously a section on the political economy, and I very much like the idea of Matthew and Fred to look at sort of global capitalism and to look at the global scale of capitalist development. But at the same time, I think many of the other papers also highlight the fact that it is important to have in mind different geographical scales, right? I mean, so in some respects, to look at the interaction between the global, the transnational, the national, the regional, the local, and to see how, in a way, the political economic development pans out in the interrelationship of those different geographical scales. So in that sense, it was good also to see the chapter on regional development, because I think it's kind of nicely balanced then between the chapters to look at the different scales. I was going to ask, because I didn't hear much about it, how important are differences in terms of industrial sector when we talk about political economy? It seems to me there are particular industrial sectors such as mining, where economic policies have been quite different across different spaces to others, say textile industries, and the gender aspect of that as well. That textiles employs largely women. We have seen far fewer, as far as I can see, industrial policies surrounding textiles than we have seen surrounding male industries such as mining or steel. So in that sense, maybe we should also talk about industrial sector. And then my last comment on the really fascinating paper by Lachlan on regional developments and regional identity. For the Ruhr in Germany, I've always been slightly skeptical of regional identity, because it always struck me as being very homogenizing, in the sense that when you talk about regional identity, you quickly lose sight of all of the things that might fissure the region, the homogeneity of regional identity, and that includes class and race, ethnicity, religion. There are lots of things which, in a way, when you're interested in promoting regional identity and you want to see the region as a whole, you don't talk about these things that divide the region. But of course, you gave excellent examples of how the two can also go together. How, in a way, regional identity and class identity might, in fact, work together. So it makes me think maybe we should reflect more on how, in a way, regional identity is used by different actors for different purposes in different circumstances. But again, thank you very much to all of you, because I think it was terrific papers.
Okay, so I think there's several questions there. So maybe we can start with Lachlan on region. But I was thinking about your question around sector. I thought maybe Xavier might be able to jump in there. But I think there's also that wider question about where's gender, right? In political economy, I think could be raised by everyone here. But we'll start with those two, and then we'll sort of see if anyone else wants to jump in. Lachlan.
Yeah, that's a great point, Stefan. And in fact, you do see that how region is adopted differently by different groups. So the maritime rights protest movement that I talked about, and this is kind of a debate within the scholarship between Ernie Forbes and David Frank, two people who wrote about this early on. Maritime rights really drew upon more of a middle class sensibility of region, rooted in kind of the journalism of Halifax and St. John and thinking politically about Canada. Now, David Frank argues that the working class social movements that emerged in Cape Breton and in other parts of the province kind of combined regional sensibility with kind of an overarching focus on like class experience. He talks about the coal towns, but I think maybe that's broader than that. But of course, it's not just region, right? And what got me thinking about this was how in later protest movements in the 1960s, for example, yes, you see them adopting this sort of fight back language that characterizes many protests against closure across North America, but also this idea that this is kind of a regional experience within the Canadian story, right? And so that had me thinking about, well, certainly region's not the total, the overarching kind of thing that brings it all together, but I think it's a mechanism that does inform, number one, how populations respond, and number two, you also really see it being adopted by different levels of government, right? Because it allows governments to explain kind of disparity and then provide that as an explanation for kind of intervention, rather than agreeing with some of the more kind of radical critiques of political economy that are given voice to by like the left or things like that. And so you see at the same time, like regional development, Canadian equalization, all of these sorts of projects kind of emerge during this moment. And I think that they're all kind of connected in sort of this way. But as you say, it's not kind of a totalizing thing, but thank you for the point.
Xavier?
Yes, I agree with Stefan. There was no industrial policy in textile. As Stefan knows, since the 17th century, there has been in France an industrial policy when the greatness of France is in question. And obviously, it was not there was not a national stake for the textile industry. The problem is, as Stefan says, that obviously this has consequences in terms of jobs for women, of course. The second aspect I would like to underline is a kind of social danger for coal, as in Britain, for coal mines and steel industry. A mobilization could be a danger for the power and for the government, and of course that's why there was an industrial system, as Marion has shown for the coal mine. The danger was less evident in textile industry, where women were very weak, and factories were more reduced. So there was no danger. That's why there was no industrial policy for textile, for instance, in France.
Does anyone else want to jump in on Stefan's sort of cluster, even like scale, like the scale that we use and the relationship between sort of scale?
I'll say very briefly, thanks for the excellent comment and question. Our intention is not to suggest that now we need to go international or transnational. There are different points of view and different potential arguments, different potential solutions to globalization, or sorry, to deindustrialization, when you take it from each of these different geographic positions. So different geographic, but also what we call spatio-temporal ways of looking at the problem opens up different questions and potentially different answers. So it's absolutely essential, in my view, to work within these different registers and to consider how they relate. The question of gender that Steve raised, I also wanted to speak to as I was talking about social reproduction theory, which is probably the central contribution of Marxist feminism to the overall Marxian lineage. And indeed, I should have mentioned in my presentation, my defense, I only had 5 minutes, but that a lot of what I was talking about is gendered experience of workplaces and labor. The first waves of industrial migrants to cities were overwhelmingly female in the Chinese example. And the dormitory model was based on the exploitation of women in these industrial relationships, both the cooking and cleaning, but also the workers, often women in proximity, driving the Chinese miracle, so to speak, but then written out of the nationalist narrative. And something similar happened in Japan. There's an excessive focus, I think, on the heavy industry jobs of shipbuilding, for example, and petrochemical in the 1950s and 1960s, leaving out what were high value export industries in industry, light industry, and also in piecework across the entire country. So with all of this sort of blocked from the view of the nationalist presentation of the Japanese economic miracle and so on, there's a one-sided way of looking at that history that has all continued at present to ignore or overlook the fact, for example, that there's a higher workforce participation rate of women in Japan than there is in the United States. And this doesn't fit with national self-image, and it doesn't fit with our understanding of these economies in relation, but it definitely speaks to a need to bring the question of gender into these lines of analysis. So thanks very much for your excellent comment and question.
Great. Gabrielle.
There's a question in the chat that I'll read on behalf of Aparna. So deindustrialization and urban land are inextricably connected in the global south, with land being handled informally. In parentheses, the land tenure is ambiguous or claim on land is made through political negotiation. How does this impact on the unfolding of deindustrialization in the global south? And was that an issue in the global north? My assumption is that it was not. The question isn't addressed to any speaker in particular, so if anybody is willing to jump in, that would be great.
Like, Fred, do you want to maybe jump in on that?
No, I mean, I think it's a great question. I don't know the answer. Matthew might be able, and I actually might wonder if Indranil might be able to speak to that.
Okay, Indranil?
So I am really confused about Aparna's saying that land being handled informally in Global South. I don't know what does she mean by this, because land is a commodity in Global South, and we have seen over the years from in the post-colonial period that land has been traded in different ways, and state took over land from the farmers, or farmers used the land for creating more and more agricultural commodities. Look at Punjab, look at Haryana in the north. And recently we have seen that what happened to the Tatars Nano coming in West Bengal and taking away the land from the farmers, and there's a revolt against that. So if Aparna can kindly can explain what she meant by land being handled informally.
Well, we'll come back to that, I guess. Like, we have other hands. Maybe Lauren?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for those great presentations. I have a question about the idea or field of political economy itself. And maybe this is also a question about the editorial process for this book. So if you went into writing your particular contribution knowing that you would be in a political economy section, and then secondly, like, how does your work engage with political economy? You know, this is a field that's existed for a long time, and I think we implicitly draw upon a lot of its insights and methods without necessarily seeing our work in deindustrialization studies as part of this longer tradition. So yeah, if you guys could just speak to political economy.
Maybe Jason could start off with that,
Yeah.
and then Alice. Yeah.
Yeah, I just have brief thoughts. I mean, yeah, I mean, my own sort of arc is what we kind of is maybe more similar to, at least my beginnings anyway, was more similar to others in this group, in the sense of sort of like thinking about deindustrialization in the Midwest and Northeast in the United States, and then eventually in Ontario. And you know, I am interested in racial discrimination in general, but there's a particular subset of it that I think is really compelling, and I think underutilized, I think, in deindustrialization literatures and sort of broadly kind of political economy literatures in general, and that is the racial capitalism literature that is really explicitly about thinking about ways that dehumanization serves as a justification for further exploitation. So it's racial discrimination in a specifically political economic framework. So it's very much in the back of my mind, and I think that you know, yeah, I didn't. I knew that this was about political economy, and it's not. It's more for me. It's less about sort of replacing that than supplementing or augmenting that with an emphasis on the the billions of human beings on Earth that are non-white and working class, and the fact that the majority of North America are of non-white people are working class. So maybe adding this, and there's plenty there to work with. So, yeah.
Alice?
Thanks. Great question. I mean, I think I got into deindustrialization as a topic based on studying political economy. And what I always found helpful about it was actually just that kind of how and why question, looking at landscapes and people and communities suffering through job losses, looking at abandoned warehouses and decimated communities. How did this happen? It happens because of, patterns within the global and regional and various spatial scales of political economy. And I guess the most simple answer to that was initially thinking about the uneven geography of capitalist development, the work of David Harvey. And I think that has an incredible resonance today, like no matter where, like the dispossession of capital accumulation. But at the same time, I think political economy is only answers some questions. So it can be quite abstract. It can, it needs a gender analysis, like the work of Silvia Federici on the commons and on enclosures, the interventions of racial capitalism, absolutely, because capitalism is based very much on racism. And so I still see myself very much coming from that tradition, but I think it does need to move beyond the abstractions to engage with the complexities of and nuances of experience.
That's great. Fred, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just editorially, I dare say, I think Stephen asked people to contribute who are already trying to kind of think in terms of political economy, rather than us having to like shoehorn our work into that framework. I would say that for Matthew and I, Matthew, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but political economy, it's interesting to think about it in terms of the Marxian lineage, because it's not sort of critical political economy. It is a critique of political economy as basic kind of assumptions about the workings of life and the interaction between humans and nature. And there are these assumptions, these kind of essentially bourgeois economic assumptions are written into deindustrialization studies when we think about the transfer of jobs from the global north to the global south. Essentially, there was cheap labor in the global north, and then there were union movements, and then it was no longer cheap, and then companies said, oh, we're going to the global south because their labor is cheap. Whereas I think if you kind of try to understand the process of capital accumulation and the generation of surplus value, you can, where there is an argument to be made that in fact there are other things going on than simply the kind of the quest of capital, as kind of Cowie puts it, from one cheap labor zone to the other, including many parts of the world in which you can think of Taiwan or Japan is a really good example, in which the move of capital there actually generated sort of unprecedented collective wealth and standard of living all that to say that, you know, there are things going on in terms of the flow of capital from one zone to the other that are more complex than kind of the simple, you know, cheap labor, then expensive labor, and then moving, that we have come to use as our sort of basic understanding in the field for why capital went elsewhere.
We're approaching the this is great, and we're approaching the end of the time. But I'll just note that Aparna did clarify what she meant in the comments, and so thinking about sort of attachment to place and claims to place in the context of industrial abandonment, which I think we see, you know, like this whole notion of left behind places and what that means. I think this is a really, you know, really important topic. But maybe we can just, I know some other questions, but I think any last comments or reflections from the panelists on, you know, where the field needs to go. I think we've heard already from Fred and Matthew on that, but I mean, like what's the next step, and what needs to happen going forward? You know, grounded in your own work. And maybe we can start with like Jason and back to Alice, because I think both of yours are very much sort of interventions, I think, in the field, as is everybody else's for that matter, but we'll start there.
I don't know that I have anything particularly compelling to say, except that I think that there are, and again, just kind of thinking about my own arc, is that you know, my own supervisor ages ago was Neil Smith, and so I come from this kind of David Harvey tradition of, like, you know, conventional political economy. That there's a lot of, I say that conventional, I should use quote marks, that there have been a number of very compelling bodies of literature that have largely been kind of ignored, that are in the political economy canon, that I think ought not to have been ever ignored in the same way. And that I think that you know, in some ways the answer is not about sort of devising something new. It's about spending time with literatures that have always been there, but in gender and race, in coloniality, that I think have been there and been emphasizing these themes, maybe without the same emphasis on political economy, but often very much with that emphasis. So there's a subset of all of those literature. So maybe my only quip would be that sort of like the answer is kind of re-education of, you know, around themes that more than it is devising or new emphases, at least initially.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree. I think often as a field we talk about like Bluestone and Harrison, and we sort of end there, you know. And I've been re-engaging a lot with Doreen Massey's work, her early work, and I find it really, really useful and timely. Alice.
It's a rather big question, and I wouldn't want to be presumptuous either about where the field ought to go. I mean, I think everybody's little, you know, intervention makes sense in terms of where they're coming from. Probably more engagement with those questions in the global south are where a lot of the conversation and research needs to go, because that's where you know, a lot of the industry is and will face those challenges and differences. So yeah, I mean, exactly as you've been designing in the project, Stephen, with, you know, that focus on transnational, but not just based in Europe and North America, and thinking historically, but also of the future. And yeah, trying to think through all those complexities of issues of class, race, gender, ecology. You're doing that work. So back to you.
Well, we're over time. Although I would have, well, maybe we'll just let like Xavier have the last word, and then we'll end with Xavier. Any thoughts?
I can't speak for Marion, of course. For my part, I'm waiting for authorization to study François Mitterrand archive on the industrialization, and see what has been done or not done in France during the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. And that's to see this question of left-wing nationalism. I think it's a key problem at the European scale. Of course, it doesn't fit in the global question you suggest, but yes, for the French case and for the West European case, I think it's a huge problem.
Mm. And certainly thinking about the left in relation to or coming back to like the motion of like the question of resistance, or even Alice's point of how can we do better, right? And how do we organize to do that? I think these are all very important questions. So thank you all. Big round of applause for the presenters, but also thank you to all the attendees who've been dropping like flies in the last 5 minutes. But thank you for those of you who stayed right to the end. And we'll be having probably three roundtables next term. So we'll have more of these conversations going forward. And for those of you who don't know, the next Depot conference is in Glasgow in late June, right? And it's focused on gender. And we had a huge response to our call for papers. And so it's going to be a great conference as well, just as the last two were. So thank you all, and have a good December. All the best.